Hi, I just want to start off by saying if you want an answer at the end, prepare to be disappointed. There just isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course, most internships aren't, but it did have some perks beyond education. To adults it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired. I'll get right to it without giving too many unnecessary details. So, at the time, they had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season. But the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it wasn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us with phony, oftentimes lewd titles, such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye by Valve. You know, nothing particularly funny, but work-related chuckles. So, when we saw the title card, Squidward's Suicide, we didn't think it more than a morbid joke. Even one of the interns did a small chuckle because of it. Then the happy-go-lucky flute music played as normal. The story began with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside and Squidward stopped, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and needed the practice. SpongeBob says okay and goes to see Sandy with Patrick. Anyways, things began to seem off at Squidward's concert. A few frames repeated themselves while Squidward was playing, but the sound continued flawlessly. At this point, sound is always already synced up with animation, so yes, it was not common. But when he stopped playing, the sound and animation was perfectly synced, as if the skip never happened. The crowd started murmuring slightly before they began booing him. I have to say it was not the normal cartoon booing that's common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. The shot goes to Squidward in full frame looking visibly afraid. The shot then goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in center frame, and he too was booing, very much unlike him, but that wasn't the oddest thing though. What was odd was that everyone had hyperrealistic eyes, very detailed. Clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but if you know SpongeBob, you should know what I mean. With this, some of us looked at each other obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children yet. The shot again goes to Squidward, now sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is still of a night sky, so we know it's not very long after the concert. The most unsettling part at this point was that there was no sound, literally no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though it was pretty obvious from their status that they were actually working perfectly. Squidward just sat there, blinking in the silence for around 30 seconds, then he started to sob softly. He had his hands, or tentacles, over his eyes and cried quietly for another full minute. All the while a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly began to zoom in on his face. By slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at the shots 10 seconds apart side by side. By now, his sobbing got louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches as if it twisted in on itself for a split second, then back to normal. The barely audible breeze sound slowly got louder and more severe, as if a storm was brewing somewhere. The eerie part was the sound of the breeze, and Squidward's sobbing sounded too real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but it sounded so clear and real as if Squidward was just beyond the speakers. This was the sound quality the studio would like to have, but they haven't purchased any equipment to produce sound of that quality. It was very confusing. Beneath the sound of the wind and sobbing, a very faint laughing could be heard. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so it was hard pinning it. Pardon me if things sounded too specific. We watched this show twice and I've actually had time to think this through. Anyways, after 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently and something flashed over the screen as if a single frame was replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound it frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6. The face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face popped. He was naked down to his underwear, his stomach crudely cut open and his entrails laying beside him. He was laying on some pavement that was probably a road. The most upsetting part was that there was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence, tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It seemed that the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were of course mortified, but pressed on, hoping that it was just a sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, still sobbing, louder than before and half body and frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was all done in hyperrealistic style, looking as if you touched it, you'd get blood on your own fingers. Now sounded like a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a deep baritone, was coming more frequently and lasted longer, and after about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed on a single frame another photo. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. This child was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was popped out and she was also naked to her underpants. Her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on a street, and the photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape as the first photo. By then, I had to choke back my vomit and one of the interns with me had to run out because she couldn't stand it. The show was then resumed. Squidward suddenly went silent, as did all the background sound, just like how it was at the start. He put his tentacles down and his eyes were now done in hyperrealism like the others were in the beginning of this episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot, and pulsating. Then he just stared at the screen as if watching the viewers, watching us. After about another 10 seconds, he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound of his sobbing was piercing and loud, and the most fear-inducing of all was his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back and so did the deep laughing, and this time another still photo came on, but this one lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator was able to stop it on the 4th and backed up. It was a photo of a boy about the same age as the other children, but this time the scene was slightly different. The entrails were just being pulled out from the stomach by a large hand. The right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down. The animator played the video frame by frame. He went back to the first and played them quicker, and I lost it. I vomited on the floor, the animating and sound editors gasping at the screen. The 5 frames were actually 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw the hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focused on it. We even saw 2 frames with the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creator to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once the few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound stopped. Squidward was just staring at the viewer, his face in full frame for about 3 seconds. The shot then quickly panned out and a deep voice suddenly said, "Do it." And this is when we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the shotgun in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Blood and brain matter splattered the wall behind him and his bed, and he flew back with so much force. The last 5 seconds of this episode showed his body on the bed, on his side, with one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. The episode then ended. Mr. Hillenberg was obviously angry at this. He demanded to know what was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. The only theory we could think of was that the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyze when it happened. The analysis of the file did show that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds right before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware, as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have glitched and showed us the wrong time, but everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. No child scene was identified, and no clues were gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I never believed in unexplainable phenomena before, but let's just say I changed my mind.